16 days now to go to the end of the transition period and the UK's complete departure from the European Union. After months, years even, of talks, negotiators from both sides announced some movement on Monday on sticking points that are preventing an agreement on future relations. We can speak now to Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London, Mr. Jonathan Portes, to get his perspective on it all. Mr. Portes, thanks for your time. Firstly, days to go only. They say there is movement. How do you see it? Do you think that they will seal a deal before the New Year's clock strikes midnight?
The simple answer is that nobody knows, because these are ultimately political decisions. The negotiators have known for some months what the possible outlines of a deal looks like. In that sense, not very much has changed, in fact, from during the last 9 months or so. The real question is whether the politicians on both sides, and perhaps most importantly, obviously Boris Johnson and to some extent President Macron, actually want to make the fundamentally political concessions that are necessary to make a deal, or whether they prefer, from a political perspective, a no deal in which they can blame the other side.
Of course, a political deal, but one that impacts directly, of course, the public that elect them. Give us a broad idea of, if they don't strike a deal, we know that the UK would go back to WTO rules, but what happens for people on either side? I mean, things like planes. What happens on January 1st if no deal is signed?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that most of the important changes for people and for business are going to happen deal or no deal. There are going to be new border controls. There are going to be new border checks. There are going to be major new trade barriers between the UK and the rest of Europe, and it will be more difficult for people to travel between the UK and the rest of Europe. It will be much more difficult for people to move, to work, to live, or to study from the UK to Europe, or to vice versa. All those actually happen deal or no deal. No deal would make it worse in a number of ways. In particular, it would sour the political relationship. It would lead to additional tariffs and trade barriers, and it would lead to quite possibly a very immediate confrontation about fishing rights. But actually, most of these new barriers, which are going to affect people and businesses, which are going to make it more difficult, especially for people to move to live and work, those are happening anyway, deal or no deal.
Indeed. Looking at the economic side of things, the options are a trade deal like Canada or back to World Trade Organization rules. Either way, as you point out, and those who supported Brexit, they'll get what they wanted, maybe in terms of gaining control of a wide range of economic policies. But what in practical terms do you think the UK wants to change when it comes to their economic policies?
Well, that's a very good question indeed, because although Brexiteers have made a big deal about the new sovereignty that the UK will have, it's quite hard to pin down specific regulatory policies that they want to change. Perhaps the most important is immigration. And immigration, there things will change quite a lot from the 1st of January. Instead of the previous system we had, where Europeans could come here to live, work, study, and so on very easily, without any checks at all, really. Europeans will be subject to precisely the same checks as non-Europeans, which are considerably more restrictive, bureaucratic, and expensive. So there will be that very big change on immigration policies, on the rights of people to come and live here. But beyond that, I think there's this misconception, and one which has been fed by some people on the Brexit side, that the UK wants to radically deregulate, reduce environmental and labour regulations, become Singapore on Thames, in a phrase which Mrs. Merkel used once. That simply isn't going to happen. Some people would like it to happen, but there just isn't the political support behind it, even in the Prime Minister's own Conservative Party, let alone in the wider British public, because the wider British public, when it comes down to it, may not know it, but in terms of their attitudes towards state intervention, the welfare state, environmental and labour protections, and all of that, we're actually really quite European. It's just not the case that there is a political momentum here for the idea that we're suddenly going to go back to working 7 days a week or abolish equal rights for women. That's not going to happen. So in that sense, a lot of this argument may well be about things which actually neither the UK government or the UK people really want to do.
Indeed, because one of the major sticking points is this fair competition, level playing field. And one of the big fears on the EU side of things seems to be something you've just mentioned there. It's state aid to companies. But when you look at the UK, I mean, that hasn't been the road it's gone down in the past.
No, and I think it's unlikely that we may do somewhat more of it in the future than we did before. But ironically, again, that makes us more European rather than less. It's quite possible that in future years we may do, in contrast to what previous British governments have done under Thatcher in particular, but also under Blair, we may engage in somewhat more state aid to strategic industries or to struggling companies. But it's still unlikely we'll do as much as, say, France does at the moment. So in that sense, we're leaving Europe in order to become more French, which is rather ironic. It's certainly, as I said, the idea that the UK is going to engage in some sort of South Korea-style attempt to build up industrial conglomerates over the next 20 or 30 years as part of an industrial strategy. That is very, very unlikely to happen indeed. The UK's approach to state aid, as with other things, is likely to remain very much between part of within the European mainstream, and we're very unlikely to be doing very many things which other European countries at one point or another haven't done as members of the European Union within the European Union framework. So a lot of these new freedoms we're having, as I said, with the big exception of immigration, are going to remain largely theoretical. And to that extent, this is very much a dispute, as far as the UK and Boris Johnson is concerned, a dispute about our theoretical right to do things differently, as opposed to because they have any great plans to do so, which would in any particular way threaten the European single market.
Very finally and very briefly, Mr. Portes, we're just seeing of this Tuesday the confirmation of Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. Do you think that that has changed how the UK sees Brexit?
Well, I think that even under Trump, the prospects of a UK-US trade deal had already begun to recede. So in that sense, it doesn't. I mean, I think in the broader perspective, the fact that Biden will be making a priority of reestablishing, not necessarily going back to where we were 20 years ago, but at least reestablishing a good working relationship and geopolitical cooperation with the European Union, makes Brexit, on the one hand, there is less risk that the UK will go off on its own and try and engage in an alliance directly with Trump and co. And that's, I think, it should be comfort both to sane people, both in the UK and the US, both in the UK and the European Union. I think it makes Brexit less of a danger to the EU and to wider geopolitical alliances.
Mr. Jonathan Portes of King's College London, thanks so much for your time and bringing us your perspective on those Brexit talks.